There were general strikes which were held in Lima and in solidarity with the movement in the Amazon, and even the campesinos in the highlands and the mountains in Peru began blocking the roads and so on. And finally, the government realized that things were getting out of control, and they agreed to negotiate, very much as happened in Mexico in 1994. And if people remember what happened in Mexico in 1994, government negotiators actually sat down at the table with Maya indigenous peasants wearing face masks. And what happened in Peru just in 2009 is, cabinet members of the Peruvian government actually sat down to negotiate with indigenous leaders from the Peruvian Amazon wearing war paint on their faces, and a real humiliation for the sort of, the political elite in Mexico that this actually came to pass. It was a partial victory, because the most egregious of these legislative decrees was in fact overturned by the Peruvian Congress as a fruit of these negotiations. There were others which the indigenous communities are still demanding be overturned, but the worst of them, particularly legislative decree number 1015, which just like the constitutional reforms in Mexico 15 years earlier, had called for lubricating the process by which indigenous lands could be sold off to corporate interest, was in fact overturned. So this was a partial victory. What's happened since then is that the struggle has really started to move from the Amazon basin, where the big issue is oil, up into the mountains and the highlands of Peru, where the big issue is minerals. And there was last year there was another paro, another general strike, which lasted for several months, in fact, and a few people were killed at a place called Puno, which is in the south of Peru, on the shores of Lake Titicaca, over a mineral project owned by one Bear Creek Mining, which is based in Vancouver in Canada. And the government was completely intransigent. This was one of the, just before Alan Garcia was going to leave office. And finally, when the new guy, Ollanta Humala, took power in, I believe it was September of last year, he agreed to negotiate with the indigenous movement, Aymara indigenous movement in Puno, and for the moment, the Bear Creek mining project in Puno has been suspended. But what's happened in the interim is that Humala flipped on his campaign promise to stop the Conga project up in the north of the country in Cajamarca, which is much bigger than the one in Puno. A lot more investment dollars at stake. So after he had pledged to stop it when he was on the campaign trail, once he got into office, he flipped and said that they were going to go ahead with it. And there had been an environmental review process which had taken place under the previous president, who had actually signed the free trade agreement with the United States, Alan Garcia. And everybody had acknowledged that this environmental review process was tainted, and that there had been all of this corner cutting in terms of the impacts on the water. It should be said that this meant that the place where they want to to mine for gold up at Conga, there's now 4 lagunas, highland lakes, right at that very point. Very critical, almost right on South America's continental divide. So there are rivers which originate there, which flow both into the Pacific and into the Atlantic through the Amazon basin. And the mining company Newmont proposes to destroy these 4 lakes. 2 of them they're going to turn into giant mining pits because the gold lies underneath them. And the other 2 they're going to turn into pits where they're going to dump the tailings. So the indigenous peoples in the region, whose waters have already been impacted by the nearby Yanacocha mine, developed by the same company, said, no way, we're not going to allow this to happen. And there's been, as I say, a whole series of general strikes which have taken place, and more than once it's come to deadly violence. At the moment, following the violence in July, when 5 people were killed, when the National Police opened fire on unarmed protesters in Cajamarca, Then Newmont Mining said, well, okay, maybe we're going to take our money and go elsewhere. We've got investments in Indonesia and in the United States and Nevada. And if things aren't going to work out in Peru, we're going to take our ball and go home. So ostensibly, the project is suspended, but the Humala administration is in negotiations with Newmont Mining, trying to woo them back. So it hasn't been canceled, it's been suspended, and meanwhile, the peasants are continuing to occupy the concession site at Conga, and there's also a large contingent of the National Police up there. And I should say the National Police, it's not quite like the NYPD. The NYPD themselves are getting quite militarized, but the National Police they look more like army troops. They carry AK-47s and M16s and dress in full camo and so on. So, and meanwhile, while this has been going on, there was another situation of a place called Tintaya in Cusco, where a Swiss company by the name of Xstrata has got a mining project which the local peasants are opposed to, and similarly, also back in July, just about the same time that things were heating up in Cajamarca, the National Police opened fire on protesters there and killed some people. In terms of what the environmental stakes of these problems are, there was one horrible case in a place called Ancash, also in the highlands of Peru, where a dam which was holding back toxic waste burst, and the toxic waste was heading towards the river, which the indigenous peoples there and the campesinos depend on for agriculture, and they just spontaneously mobilized to try to erect sandbags and so on to prevent the waste from reaching their river, and in the process they were inhaling all these toxic fumes, and something like 30 people were hospitalized. There was also a similar case. There was a spill on the Marañón River from a mineral project earlier this year. On the Marañón River from a mineral project earlier this year. And there's been a whole series of spills in the Amazon basin from the oil projects which have been going on there. And on the subject of what the impacts are going to be, on the legal front, it should be noted that reference was made to the case which was decided right here in Manhattan in the Second District, Circuit Court of Appeals, where the Chevron Corporation had been seeking a so-called global injunction, which is a rather dubious legal concept, against being able to collect damages against the government of Ecuador, being able to collect damages for oil spills in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And the Second Circuit Court of Appeals said, no, there's no such thing as a global injunction. We can't enforce Ecuadorian law on U.S. soil, no dice. And Chevron appealed it to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court refused to hear it. So this is a good thing. But meanwhile, the Chevron is also challenging the judgment under a special panel which was created by the U.S.-Ecuador Free Trade Agreement. And similarly, in the case of Doron, which the previous speaker also mentioned, the company is not only suing over Peru shutting down the smelter itself, which is considered to be Peru's Chernobyl, but similarly, a bunch of residents in the nearby village of La Arroya are suing Doron in the U.S. courts over the pollution that they have been exposed to, and this is also being challenged by the company before a free trade panel, which was established by the U.S.-Peru Free Trade Agreement. It should be noted that, unfortunately, the community of La Arroya is very much divided. There are there are the campesinos who depend on agriculture, who are opposed to the smelter, and there were the people who worked at the smelter who were closed out of work when it was thrown out of work when the smelter was closed, who want it reopened. So inevitably, we're faced with the whole dilemma of, quote, jobs versus environment, unquote. And certainly, this is something which there needs to be a dialogue about in Peru and in this country. And there has to be some kind of answer to the people whose livelihood depends on these industrial projects. But certainly, these free trade agreements which throw out any notion of public oversight and just encode in law the notion of letting the pigs run